and welcome to this module, where to apply robotic process automation. In the previous module, we learned that robotic process automation is the application of software robots in order to optimize your processes. Because of the specific nature of software robots and the many types of software robots available, it's important to know what type of processes are most applicable to be optimized by software robots. In this module, we will learn how to select the processes that provide you with the most benefit when applying robotic process automation. And we're going to approach this module by first classifying robots. There are so many types of software robots out there, and there are so many ways that you can program them that it's important that we classify the robots to give you an impression of the possibilities of RPA. Then we'll go into detail about what processes are best automated by the use of software robots. And finally, besides automation, we will look at alternative uses of RPA that might provide a good business case for your organization. Alright then, so let's get started on this module. So when we look at the vendors of RPA software, there are many options available to us. There are many ways in which software robots can be configured, and it's important that we classify those robots to see what is possible and what can best be applied in your organization. Now, in order to take a structured approach to classifying robots, it's important that we determine some characteristics. So first of all, we will look at the attendance of robots. And basically we have two versions. We have an unattended robot, which will operate all by itself, and an attended robot that has some human intervention. Then we'll look at the intelligence of the robot, so whether or not it is based on business rules, whether or not it does analysis over multiple data sources, or that it is a self-learning system. We will look at the way that the robot operates with data, so whether or not it uses structured or unstructured data, and in what way it does analysis of data or manipulation of data. Then there is the interaction of the software robot with the actual software, so that can be directly on the back end, on the application layer, or mimicking input from the user. And lastly, we will look at the way that processes are defined within the robot. So if we have any specific triggers for this robot, and how it handles the flow between different steps in the process. So let's take a close look at each one of these. When we look at attendance, you have an unattended and an attended robot. To give an example of an unattended robot, let's say we have a process that starts when a file ends up in a specific folder. In that case, the software robot scans the document, and it determines, based on some business rules, whether or not this document has sensitive information. If it does, the software robot sends a warning to the user. If it does not, it deletes the document from the folder and everything is good to go. Now there are two endings to this process. It either ends in a warning to the user, or it ends cleanly, and there's no action taken by the robot besides deleting the document. Now in this specific process, there is no human intervention. The moment the file ends up in the folder, the robot takes over and it executes everything unattended. On the opposite side, we have an attended process if, for instance, after the sensitivity check, if there is sensitive data in the document, we let a human examine the document in question, and if there was no bad intention, then a notification is sent to the user, but if there is bad intention, then a warning is sent to the user. This again results in two different endings. The difference is that in the first process, there is no human intervention, and in the second process, there is some human action that needs to be taken within the process, and we refer to this as an attended robot. This is an important characteristic to keep in mind when setting up your robot. Then besides attendance, we also have intelligence. And this is the way that the robot receives input from the environment. This can be based on business rules, so that is the logic to be programmed into the robot, but it can also be based on analysis. A good example, for instance, is a robot that scans social media, and based on analytic data, it makes certain decisions. And we can also use machine learning and artificial intelligence within our robot to make it a self-learning robot. Given the state of robotic process automation at this time and the maturity of the different tooling out there, it's safe to say that most robots are now based on business rules, and there is only limited capability with regards to analysis and learning systems. However, it is important to characterize your robot based on the intelligence it receives. Next to intelligence, we also have the way that your robot interacts with data. So, it might handle structured data, but it might also handle unstructured data. As we will learn later in this module, software robots are usually better with handling structured data as opposed to unstructured data, but we will provide more detail on that later. It's also important to specify how your robot will analyze data that is sent to it and how it does data manipulation. You need to specify these things up front in order to select the best tooling for your robot, but also know how your robot will interact with this environment. Another important aspect is the interaction of the robot with the rest of the software systems around it. So, You might interact with the backend of applications, so you plug in directly into the API or the database. You can operate on the application layer, like we did in the demo in the first module. There we operated directly into the Excel application, but it's also possible to mimic the input that is usually given by the user into the application. We also provided an example of that in the demo in the previous module, where we interacted with the PowerPoint application based on clicks and things we type into the application. And lastly, it's important to identify what the process that the robot follows actually looks like. What are the triggers of the process, in this case a file that is put into a folder, or whether or not it's sensitive data, and what are the actual steps that the robot has to go through in order to be effective. So, the process is also something you want to define when setting up your robot. Now, all of the different RPA vendors out there will have different ways in which these aspects of robots are implemented. However, it's important to realize what the needs of your robot are and how you can actually realize those. When we take the demo of the previous module as an example, we can characterize this as an attended robot because it was triggered by us once we selected the Excel sheet. The intelligence was based on business rules that we programmed into the robot, and the data that it used was structured data, and it manipulated data straight into the PowerPoint. With regards to interaction, we interacted directly with the Excel application, and for the PowerPoint application, we did that by mimicking input from the user. The trigger from the process was us executing the robot, and the flow that it went through was to first look at the Excel database, and then taking that input and inserting it into the PowerPoint. So this overview is a good way to classify your robot and see what characteristics it needs to operate and how you can best implement the robot. Now in the next clip, let's take a look at what processes are best suited to be automated by means of robotic process automation.